She finally talks about Humphrey Bogart when she is 67 years old. Ava Gardner was born on December 24, 1922, in Grabtown, North Carolina. Her full name was Ava Lavinia Gardner. Ava grew up in a simple working-class home. Her early life was shaped by the struggles and strength that many people in the South went through during the Great Depression. Sharecroppers who worked for tobacco farms and were poor. Ava was the youngest of 7 children. Even though she had to deal with personal and financial problems as a child, she was naturally beautiful and had a presence that would later define her screen image. Her Southern roots were still a big part of who she was. They affected how she behaved and how she went about her life and work. She had a unique style that was a mix of natural elegance and down-to-earth honesty. It was a mix of luck, timing, and undeniable ability that got Ava into Hollywood. Talent scouts from MGM found her in the early 1940s. They were captivated by both her striking physical beauty, her luminous green eyes, honey blonde hair, and classic features, and the passion and charisma that she exuded. In the beginning of her career, Gardner had small parts that helped show off her acting skills. But it was her big break in films like The Killers, 1946, that made her famous as a major movie star. She was more talented than just pretty when she played complicated, often morally ambiguous women. She could easily switch between parts of seduction, vulnerability, and fierce independence. In her career, Ava Gardner worked with some of the best directors and stars of her time, like John Huston, Humphrey Bogart, and Burt Lancaster. She worked hard to get better at what she did, and her characters often had a raw emotional intensity that struck a chord with both viewers and critics. Movies like Magambo, 1953, for which she was nominated for an Academy Award, Showboat, 1951, and On the Beach, 1959, showed how versatile she was and how popular she still is. Her shows often dealt with love, loss, and strength, which showed not only how talented she was as an artist, but also how well she understood how people feel. As soon as Ava Gardner got to Los Angeles and started working for MGM, she met Mickey Rooney, who was one of the studio's biggest and best young stars. At the time, Rooney was a well-known and loved actor all over the United States for playing the good guy Andy Hardy in the film series. The two fell in love quickly, and even though Gardner grew up in a small town and wasn't used to living in Hollywood's fast-paced world, she was smitten by Rooney's charm, humor, and high energy. They got together quickly and got married on January 10, 1942, when Gardner was only 19 years old. The event took place in Ballard, California, a small town that is very far from the big city of Los Angeles. This choice wasn't just based on secrecy, it was planned by Louis B. Mayer, who was the head of MGM Studios. Mayer was afraid that the news of Rooney's wedding would hurt Andy Hardy's public image as the all-American boy next door. Mayer was afraid that fans, especially young girls who looked up to Rooney, would lose interest in the good guy's single image that had made him such a big hit at the box office if people found out he was married to Gardner. The marriage fell apart almost as quickly as it started, which was a shame. Gardner found that Rooney had a darker side that included a lot of gaming and going out with women. Rooney seemed innocent in public, but behind closed doors he lived fast, going to late-night parties, having affairs, and spending a lot of money without thinking. Gardner was upset by his behavior because she was still getting used to living in Hollywood. In 1943, after only a year of marriage, she asked for a divorce, saying that it was for reason of mental abuse. In private, though, she blamed Rooney's addiction to gaming and his constant affairs for the end of the marriage. Even though it hurt him deeply, Gardner was careful not to hurt Rooney's reputation in the news. Because she didn't tell everyone about his flaws, she was able to keep Andy Hardy's beloved on-screen figure for his fans. The press and the studio kept up Rooney's good guy image, and Gardner left in silence. Her first marriage in Hollywood taught her a hard lesson about what's really going on behind the scenes of fame. Just a few years later, Gardner got married for the second time, this time to Artie Shaw, a famous jazz singer and band leader from the swing era. Shaw was famous for both his wonderful musical skills and his difficult and bossy attitude. He had been married to the famous actress Lana Turner. Gardner, who was only in her early 20s at the time, became deeply interested in Shaw's music and ideas. But things went badly for them quickly in their marriage. Shaw allegedly wanted Gardner to change so that she would meet his high standards. He often said bad things about Gardner's education and background. Not only did he want everything to be perfect in his music, but also in his relationships, and Gardner quickly grew tired of his smugness. They were married for only 2 years, from 1945 to 1946. It was a short and rough marriage that made Gardner lose hope in finding love again. Her third marriage, on the other hand, was the most important and long-lasting part of her love life. She married Frank Sinatra, a singer and actor, in 1951. Sinatra was just as famous as she was. Sinatra divorced his first wife, Nancy Barbato, to be with Gardner. When they got married, the news went crazy. Sinatra quitting his family for the beautiful starlet made headlines, and people became more and more interested in their relationship over time. In her book, Gardner would say that Sinatra was her first and last love. Their relationship was intense, enticing, and very difficult. There were both loving hugs and bad fights. The famed Gardner-Sinatra marriage was also very tense. Both stars had strong personalities and were very independent. They also had to deal with constant news attention. Their relationship was tense with jealousy, heated fights, and reconciliations that were just as heated as the fights. During the time they were together, Gardner got pregnant twice, but she decided to end both of them. In her autobiography, which came out 8 months after she died, she wrote that MGM had strict contract terms that made it illegal for its female stars to have children. The company was afraid that having a child would make a star less marketable and less available, and Gardner felt trapped by these fears. Her choices showed how hard it was for women in Hollywood in general. Because the studios have so much power, people have to put their jobs ahead of their personal lives. It got too much for Gardner to handle by 1954, so he filed for divorce. But it took a long time for them to legally split up, and the divorce wasn't final until 1957. They were married for a long time, but their love for each other never really went away. In fact, they were able to turn their troubled relationship into a long friendship after they got divorced. Gardner always had nice things to say about Sinatra. She called him the love of her life. In return, Sinatra continued to help and care for her. Even after the intensity had died down, they stayed close, and they stayed that way until Gardner's death in 1990. During and after they got married, their relationship was one of the most famous love stories in Hollywood, known for its drama, intensity, and lasting emotional depth. When Ava Gardner turned 67, she had already been through a lot of things that most people only do once in their lives. She was a beautiful MGM beauty, a global screen icon, the cause of several Hollywood scandals, married 3 times, traveled the world, and, in her later years, thought about her place in the golden age of films. Gardner had worked with many of Hollywood's most famous leading men, including Clark Gable, Gregory Peck, Burt Lancaster, and Frank Sinatra, who became one of her great loves. But for decades, Humphrey Bogart, a figure from Ava's past, hung over her. Other people talked about him a lot, but Ava herself rarely talked about him in detail. Although Gardner was new to Hollywood at the time, Bogart was already a well-known star. With the help of Casablanca, 1942, and The Maltese Falcon, 1941, he went from playing small parts in gangster films to becoming one of the most famous main men of the 1940s. Those who knew him thought of him as tough, cynical, and coolly distant. Friends and family who knew him well also said he was very smart, very sensitive, and very loyal to his friends. Gardner, on the other hand, didn't say much about him in public, partly out of respect, partly because of how difficult Hollywood politics are, and partly because she didn't like adding to the rumors that were going around about her. But Gardner finally let herself talk more honestly when she was in her late 60s, a long time after Bogart's death in 1957. She said with a half-smile that Bogart was one of a kind while she was thinking about things in her London flat. He wasn't just the tough guy that films made him out to be. He was smart and funny, and he made you feel like you were in on the joke. I liked that about him all the time. She stopped before going on, saying more about how Bogart's on-screen image was different from the man she knew off-screen. A lot of people forget that Bogey wasn't really a big man. His height and good looks were not as good as Cary Grant's. But the mood changed as soon as he walked into a room. He was magnetic and had personality. You looked at him all the time. You can't fake that, not in real life and not on TV. In her early years, Gardner was often unfairly brushed off as just having a pretty face. She felt like she had something in common with Bogart in that Hollywood had both of them underestimated at first. She thought, just like me, he had to fight to prove himself. At first, people thought I was just another pretty girl MGM had picked up. I didn't know anything about acts. But Bogey knew what that battle was like. That you had to prove you were more than the names they gave you. When asked about the personal things they did together, Gardner was careful but still warm in her memories. She remembered nights out with friends that Bogart and his wife Lauren Bacall put on, and she was with Bogart because she was often in the same Hollywood group as Sinatra. Bogey looked out for the people he cared about. He was good friends with Frank. I learnt more about him through Frank. He was so drunk that he could drink anyone under the table, but he always had a sparkle in his eye. Even when everyone in the room was yelling for his attention, he made you feel like you were heard. Over time, Gardner started to miss the time that Bogart portrayed, a time that was already ending by the 1950s. I think of the end of a certain Hollywood when I think of Bogey. He was from the last group that didn't care about polish. He drank, smoked, and said what he thought. Even if they tried, the companies couldn't make another Bogart. They tried with 12 other guys, but it never worked. Trust me. He was the real deal. When she told him she understood his problems, her tone softened. Sure, he wasn't perfect. Like the rest of us, he had his own problems. He was moody, stubborn, and sometimes hard to deal with. But that's what made him human. That's what made him Bogart. And I guess that's why people still can't let him go after all these years. He left something behind that can't be touched. By talking about Bogart in public at age 67, Ava Gardner not only gave people a rare look into the private life of one of Hollywood's biggest stars, but she was also thinking about her own death and memory in a way. By talking about Bogart's honesty, his charm, and his humanity, she was also confirming the things she held most dear. The fight to be taken seriously, the refusal to be reduced to an image, and the power of personality that lasts over time. Gardner let out a soft sigh as she finished her thoughts that afternoon. Her voice was full of both respect and sadness. There might not be another Bogey ever again. He was a part of his time, but he is also a part of all time. Becoming so well known is the best thing that can happen to anyone, and he deserves every bit of it. Ava Gardner's beautiful but rough life was turned upside down when she had a terrible stroke in 1986. The actor, who was once known for her radiant beauty and strong screen presence, suddenly found that her health was getting worse. Even though she had saved enough money to pay for her hospital bills, Frank Sinatra, the man who had been her true love, showed her immense love in a very special way. Sinatra, who had always cared about Ava even though they had a rough past, insisted on taking care of her treatment. In order to make sure she was safe and comfortable, he hired a private plane with medical staff to take her to an expert in the United States. For Ava, who was known for being fiercely independent and proud, letting Sinatra step in was a beautiful way to show how close they were. A link that length of time and space had never really broken. Even with all of these attempts, her health kept getting worse over the next few years. Ava Gardner died on January 25, 1990, at the age of 67. She was one of the brightest stars in the world. She died peacefully in Westminster, London, far from her home in North Carolina, from bronchopneumonia. She was surrounded by the timeless aura of Hollywood fame that had never gone away. People in the entertainment business were shocked when she died. They remembered not only her unforgettable roles in great films like The Killers, Magambo, and The Barefoot Contessa, but also the wild spirit that made her one of the most famous women in movie history. Ava Gardner was taken back to her home in Smithfield, North Carolina, 4 days later, on January 29th. She was buried in Sunset Memorial Park. So did her parents, Jonas and Molly Gardner, as well as her beloved brothers. There, the girl from a small town who had become one of the world's most famous stars found eternal peace. Fans still make the quiet trip to her grave to honor her memory by leaving flowers, notes, and other signs of respect.